Come home with me. 4 words that would shatter the silence of a rain-soaked November night and change 3 lives forever. When a single father spotted a paralyzed elderly woman abandoned at a bus stop at midnight, he had no idea his simple act of kindness would rescue not just her from the brink of despair, but his own broken family from a loneliness they didn't even know they were carrying. What happened next would prove that sometimes the family we need finds us in the most unexpected ways, when we need them most. The windshield wipers of Arthur Bruno's weathered pickup truck squeaked rhythmically against the glass as he squinted through the November darkness. 11:47 p.m. glowed on his dashboard, and the rain was getting heavier by the minute. That's when he saw her. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel.
Hunched in her wheelchair beside the dimly lit bus stop, the elderly woman looked impossibly small against the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her gray hair was soaked through, and her thin frame trembled beneath a worn coat that had clearly seen better decades. Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct told him to keep driving. He had twin daughters at home, responsibilities, a life that didn't include stopping for strangers at midnight. But something twisted deep in his chest, that familiar ache that had lived there for 4 long years. He couldn't drive past someone sitting alone in the dark, not when he knew exactly what that felt like. Rolling down his window, Arthur called out through the rain, "Ma'am, are you all right? The bus has stopped running hours ago." The woman's head turned slowly toward him, revealing a face mapped with deep lines of sorrow and eyes that held the hollow look of someone who had stopped hoping long ago. Her silver hair hung in damp strands around weathered cheeks. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Just waiting." Arthur parked and stepped out, his work boots splashing through growing puddles. Up close, he could see she was shivering, though whether from cold or something much deeper, he couldn't tell. "I'm Arthur," he said gently, crouching to meet her eyes. "What's your name?" "Gwen Carlyle," she whispered, after a long pause that seemed to stretch forever. "Just Gwen. Mrs. Gwen, it's nearly midnight and this rain isn't letting up. Do you have somewhere to go? Someone I can call?" Her laugh was bitter and hollow, like glass breaking in an empty room. "No one to call. Nowhere that wants me." She turned away from him, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Please, just leave me be. I've made my peace with sitting here." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. In her voice, he heard echoes of his own darkest moments. Those nights he had sat in his truck in empty parking lots, wondering how he could possibly keep going. "Mrs. Gwen," he said quietly, pulling off his jacket and draping it around her trembling shoulders, "I have twin daughters at home. They're 9 now, and they've taught me something important. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone help us." He paused, studying her face in the flickering streetlight. "Come home with me tonight. Just for tonight. Let me get you somewhere warm and dry." "I can't," her voice cracked like old parchment. "I'd be nothing but a burden. Look at me. I can barely manage this old wheelchair, and I haven't been anyone's responsibility for years. You have children to think about." Arthur knelt beside her wheelchair, rain soaking through his shirt. For a moment, he was transported back 4 years to a hospital room where machines beeped steadily, and his wife Margaret's hand had grown cold in his. "My girls lost their mother when they were 5, brain tumor. I've been trying to be strong enough for all 3 of us ever since. But you know what I've learned? Sometimes we need each other more than we realize." Mrs. Gwen's eyes filled with tears that mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "Your wife, I'm so sorry." "Thank you." Arthur stood, extending his hand with gentle determination. "Now please, let—"
The silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady drumming of rain on concrete. Mrs. Ginn stared at his outstretched hand as if it were something impossible, something she didn't deserve. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you help someone like me?" Arthur's throat tightened. "Because I know what it's like to sit alone in the dark," he thought. "Because Margaret would never forgive me if I drove past someone who needed help. Because my daughters need to see that kindness still exists in this world. Instead, he simply said, because it's the right thing to do. If you've ever felt invisible, forgotten by the world around you, this story will touch your very soul. Stay with us to discover how one moment of compassion changed everything. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Ginn finally allowed Arthur to help her into his truck. Her wheelchair folded with practiced ease into the truck bed, and as they drove through the quiet suburban streets, she pressed herself against the passenger window like she was trying to disappear entirely. "I should tell you," she said suddenly, her voice hollow, "I wasn't just waiting for a bus that wasn't coming." Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he kept his voice gentle. "What were you waiting for, Mrs. Ginn?" She was quiet for so long that Arthur thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words were barely audible above the engine's hum. "For it to be over. I thought maybe if I sat there long enough in the cold—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. Arthur pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the truck's roof, creating a cocoon of intimacy that made honest words feel possible. "I understand that darkness," Arthur said quietly, staring at his house's cheerful yellow siding. "After Margaret died, there were nights I sat in my truck wondering how I could possibly go on. The only thing that kept me here was knowing Maureen and Laura needed me." "But you had a reason to stay," Mrs. Gwynn whispered, her voice breaking. "I have nothing. No children, no grandchildren. My husband, Harold, died in a car accident 10 years ago, the same crash that put me in this wheelchair. 40 years we were married, and we never had children. Not by choice, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "When Harold died, he took my whole world with him." Arthur turned to look at her, seeing the depth of a decade's worth of grief carved into her features. "What about other family? Friends?" "Harold was an only child, and I lost my parents when I was young. We had each other, and that was enough. Until it wasn't." The laugh was bitter. "I worked at the library for 40 years, but when you retire and have nowhere to go home to, those relationships fade fast. People have their own lives, their own families." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Arthur knew what it meant to feel utterly alone, even surrounded by people who cared. The weight of single parenthood had nearly crushed him more than once. "Mrs. Gwynn, you have something now. You have us, if you want us." She looked at him with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. "You don't know what you're saying. I'm 70 years old, paralyzed, with nothing to offer your family but problems. Let us decide what you have to offer," Arthur said gently. "Come inside. Meet my daughters. Have some hot tea and a warm bed for the night. Tomorrow we can figure out the rest." Arthur's house was a modest 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch that looked welcoming even in the darkness. Inside, the living room told the story of a single father's life. Homework scattered across the coffee table, small sneakers by the door, and family photos covering every available surface. Mrs. Gwynn's eyes immediately went to a large portrait above the fireplace, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and Arthur's same gentle smile, flanked by 2 identical little girls with pigtails and missing teeth. "Margaret," Arthur said softly, following her gaze. "That was taken about 6 months before she got sick." Mrs. Gwynn studied the photo with the careful attention of someone who understood loss. "She looks like she was a wonderful mother." She was. Arthur's voice was thick with emotion. "She used to say that the secret to raising good kids was showing them how to notice when other people needed help. I think about that a lot." He helped Mrs. Gwynn navigate the doorway, her wheelchair moving smoothly across the hardwood floors. "Let me get you some dry clothes and show you to the guest room. Are you hungry?" She shook her head, overwhelmed by the warmth of this stranger's home. "I should leave in the morning. I don't want to impose on your family." "You're not imposing," Arthur assured her, though something in her eyes told him she'd already decided to slip away before dawn. "The guest room is just down this hall.
There's a bathroom right next door that's wheelchair accessible. We had it modified when Margaret was sick.
The guest room was simple but welcoming, with a comfortable bed, cheerful curtains, and more family photos on the dresser. Arthur brought her a warm robe and left her alone to change, but Mrs. Gwynn found herself unable to sleep. Instead, she sat by the window in her wheelchair, watching the rain streak down the glass and thinking about Harold. He would have loved Arthur's kindness, would have insisted they help somehow if their situations had been reversed. But Harold was gone, and she had spent 10 years learning to live with that emptiness. Except tonight felt different. Tonight, for the first time in a decade, she was inside a home that breathed with life and love. The walls held the laughter of children, the memories of bedtime stories and birthday parties, and all the beautiful chaos of a real family. She had forgotten what that felt like. Have you ever wondered how a single moment of kindness can change everything? Keep watching to see what happened when this broken family discovered they needed each other more than they ever imagined.
Arthur woke at 5:30 a.m. as usual, his internal clock finely tuned to the demands of single parenthood. As he padded downstairs to start coffee, he found Mrs. Gwen already awake, sitting in her wheelchair by the kitchen window and watching the sunrise paint his backyard golden. She had clearly intended to slip away before the family woke, but something had stopped her. Her overnight bag sat packed beside her chair, yet she made no move toward the door. "Good morning," Arthur said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Coffee?" She nodded gratefully, accepting the steaming mug with trembling hands. "I should go soon, before your daughters wake up. I don't want to confuse them or make things complicated." Arthur moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. "Actually, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. My girls would never forgive me if I let a guest leave without trying my famous pancakes." "Arthur, you don't understand." Mrs. Gwen's voice carried the weight of someone who had disappointed too many people. "I'm not good with children anymore. It's been so long, and they'll have questions I don't know how to answer. Children are more understanding than we give them credit for," Arthur said, beginning to mix batter. "Maureen and Laura have had to understand more than most kids their age."
As if summoned by the mention of their names, the sound of small feet thundering down the stairs filled the air. Two identical 9-year-olds burst into the kitchen, their faces bright with the kind of energy that only comes with youth and Saturday mornings. They stopped short when they spotted Mrs. Gwen, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity without a hint of fear or judgment. "Daddy, who's this?" Maureen asked with the directness that only children possess. "This is Mrs. Gwen," Arthur explained, flipping pancakes at the stove. "She's going to have breakfast with us." "Are you okay?" Laura asked, her young face creased with genuine concern as she noticed the wheelchair. "Did you hurt yourself?" Mrs. Gwen's breath caught. When was the last time someone had asked if she was okay? When was the last time anyone had looked at her with simple, honest concern instead of pity or discomfort? "A long time ago," she replied softly, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "Our mommy got hurt too," Maureen said matter-of-factly, climbing into the chair beside Mrs. Gwen. "But Daddy says she's watching us from heaven now, and she's proud of how strong we're being." The simple, innocent words hit Mrs. Gwen like a physical blow. These children, so young, had already experienced more loss than many adults. Yet here they were, bright and caring, accepting her presence without question. "I'm sure she's very proud of you both," Mrs. Gwen managed, her voice thick with emotion. Laura joined her sister at the table, chattering about their plans for the weekend. "We're going to help Daddy rake leaves today. Do you want to help? You could supervise us and make sure we don't miss any spots." I'm not sure I'd be much help, but something warm was unfurling in her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. Arthur served breakfast with the easy efficiency of years of practice. And something magical began to happen around that kitchen table. For the first time in 10 years, Mrs. Gwen found herself part of a family meal. The girls included her in their conversation naturally, asking about her life, her work at the library, her favorite books. When Maureen spilled syrup on her pajama shirt, Mrs. Gwen instinctively reached out with a napkin, cleaning the mess with the gentle touch of someone who had always longed to mother. "You're good at that," Maureen observed. "Daddy always uses too much water and makes it worse." "Hey!" Arthur protested with mock indignation, and both girls dissolved into giggles.
Mrs. Gwen found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. The sound of children's laughter, the comfortable chaos of family breakfast, the simple act of being needed, even in such a small way, it awakened something in her she thought had died with Harold. When Laura mentioned struggling with a math problem from Monday's homework, Mrs. Gwen found herself leaning forward with interest. "What kind of math problem?" she asked. Laura ran upstairs and returned with her math workbook, showing Mrs. Gwen a page of word problems that had clearly been causing frustration. "I just don't understand what they're asking," Laura said, with a sigh that seemed too old for her 9 years. Mrs. Gwen studied the problem carefully, then began to guide Laura through it with surprising patience. "Let's break it down into smaller pieces. What do we know for certain, and what are we trying to find out?" Arthur watched this exchange with growing warmth. Since Margaret's death, he had carried every burden alone. Homework help, scraped knees, bedtime stories, worried nights when the girls had fevers. Having someone else naturally step into that supportive role felt like a lifeline he hadn't realized he desperately needed. "You're really good at this," Laura said admiringly, as the math problem finally made sense. "Were you a teacher?" "I worked at the library for 40 years. I always loved helping children with their reading and homework. Some of my favorite memories are of Saturday mornings when families would come in together, and I'd help kids find just the right book for their reading level." "That sounds really nice," Maureen said wistfully. "I love the library, but we don't get to go very often because Daddy's always busy with work and taking care of us."
The admission hung in the air, heavy with implication. Arthur studied her face, seeing the vulnerability beneath her carefully composed exterior. After breakfast, as the girls ran upstairs to get dressed for their day of leaf raking, Arthur sat across from Mrs. Gwen at the now quiet table. "So," he said gently, "want to tell me what really brought you to that bus stop last night?" This is where everything changes. Don't go anywhere. What Mrs. Gwen reveals next will show you just how powerful human connection can be. Mrs. Gwen's composure finally cracked. The careful mask she had worn through breakfast dissolved, and Arthur saw the raw grief beneath. 10 years of accumulated pain and loneliness that had been eating away at her soul. "Harold and we tried for children for 20 years, she whispered, her voice breaking. "Doctors couldn't explain why it never happened. We went through treatments, tests, procedures that left us emotionally and financially drained. Eventually, we accepted that it would just be the two of us. And that was okay. Harold was enough. He was everything." Arthur waited, sensing there was more, something darker that she was building up the courage to share. The night of the accident, Harold had been driving when we got into an argument. The words came out in a rush, as if she had to say them quickly or not at all. Something stupid about money, about whether we could afford to fix the roof. I was so angry, so stubborn. I didn't even say goodbye before we pulled out of the driveway. We were on the stretch of road outside town when the brakes failed. The car ran out of control, left the road, and slammed into a tree. She pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. The police said he died instantly when the drunk driver hit him, but I lived. Woke up in the hospital 30 days later, paralyzed from the waist down, and he was already buried. I missed my own husband's funeral because I was unconscious." Arthur felt his heart constrict. The guilt she must have carried all these years. Survivor's guilt compounded by the regret of their final conversation. "Mrs. Gwen, the accident wasn't your fault. Arguments between spouses, that's just marriage. Harold knew you loved him." "Did he?" Her eyes were wild with pain. "The last words I spoke to him were angry ones. For 10 years, I've lived with that. 10 years of waking up every morning wishing I had died in that car instead of him." The raw honesty of her confession filled the kitchen with heavy silence. Upstairs, they could hear the girls getting ready, their voices a cheerful counterpoint to the grief being shared below. "Last night," Mrs. Gwen continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "was the 10-year anniversary of the accident. I went to his grave first, sat there for hours talking to a headstone, apologizing for things that can't be undone. Then I went to that bus stop and I just wanted it to end. I thought maybe if I sat there long enough in the cold rain—" "You were trying to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I was ready to give up," she said simply. "I had nothing left to give the world, nothing left to offer anyone. I've been a burden to myself for a decade. Why inflict that on anyone else?" Arthur leaned forward, his voice intense. "Mrs. Gwen, look at me. What happened this morning at breakfast, that wasn't the behavior of someone who has nothing to offer. Laura understood math for the first time in weeks because of your patience. Maureen felt comfortable and cared for because of your gentle presence. And I paused, struggling to articulate something he had barely admitted to himself. "I haven't had help with anything in 4 years. Not real help. Everyone sees me as the capable single father who has everything under control, but the truth is I'm barely holding it together most days. Having you here this morning, watching you naturally step in to help with homework, seeing my daughters respond to your kindness, it reminded me what it feels like to not carry every burden alone." Mrs. Gwen stared at him through her tears. "You're just being kind. You don't really need—" "I need you," Arthur said firmly. "My daughters need you. We're not a complete family, Mrs. Gwen. We're 3 people who love each other but are missing something essential. Margaret's death left a hole that I can't fill alone, no matter how hard I try." The sound of the girls coming back downstairs interrupted the intensity of the moment. They burst into the kitchen wearing old clothes and carrying rakes that were too big for their small frames. "Are you coming outside to help us?" Laura asked Mrs. Gwen hopefully. Mrs. Gwen looked at Arthur, then at the 2 bright faces waiting for her answer. For the first time in 10 years, someone needed her. Not out of obligation or pity, but out of genuine desire for her company. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. The next few hours passed in a blur of autumn activity that felt almost surreal to Mrs. Gwen. She positioned her wheelchair strategically around the yard, directing the girls' leaf-raking efforts and offering encouragement when their enthusiasm began to wane. "Miss Gwen, you're really good at this supervising stuff," Maureen declared, dragging a rake through a particularly stubborn pile of leaves. "I never had children to practice on," Mrs. Gwen replied, "but I supervised a lot of young library volunteers over the years." Arthur worked quietly nearby, stealing glances at the interaction between his daughters and this woman who had appeared in their lives so unexpectedly. There was something natural about the way she related to the girls, not trying too hard, not overwhelming them with attention, just being genuinely present and engaged. When Laura accidentally raked leaves onto Mrs. Gwen's wheelchair, the child immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "It's perfectly fine," Mrs. Gwen laughed, brushing the leaves from her lap. "They're just leaves, sweetheart. They'll brush right off." "But I made a mess on you," Laura said, her bottom lip trembling with the dramatic emotion of a 9-year-old. Mrs. Gwen reached out and took Laura's small hand in her weathered one. "Laura, do you see this ring on my finger?" Laura nodded, studying the simple gold band. "It belonged to my husband Harold. He used to garden every weekend, and he was always covered in dirt and leaves and grass stains. I used to fuss at him about tracking mud through the house." Her voice grew soft with memory. "I would give anything now to clean up one more muddy footprint, to brush one more leaf off his clothes. Messes made by people you care about,
Those aren't really messes at all. They're just signs that life is being lived. Laura beamed and threw her arms around Mrs. Gwen's neck in a spontaneous hug that nearly brought the old woman to tears. "I like you," she whispered against her ear. "I hope you stay for a long time." From across the yard, Arthur watched this exchange with a growing sense of rightness that he couldn't quite explain. His daughters were happy, genuinely, purely happy, in a way they hadn't been since Margaret got sick. And Mrs. Gwen, the hollow despair from the night before, had been replaced with something approaching peace. You're witnessing something incredible here, the beginning of a bond that will transform all their lives. Stay with us to see how this makeshift family learned to heal together.
As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Gwynn found herself doing things she hadn't done in years. She helped the girls make leaf piles, supervised their attempts to jump into them from the porch steps, and even found herself laughing when Maureen emerged from a particularly large pile with leaves in her hair and a grin on her face. "You should jump too, Miss Gwynn," Maureen declared. "It's really fun." "I don't think my wheelchair would handle that very well," Mrs. Gwynn said with amusement. "That's okay," Laura said matter-of-factly. "There are lots of things we can't do, but that doesn't mean we can't have fun." The simple wisdom of a 9-year-old struck Mrs. Gwynn with unexpected force. When had she stopped believing that happiness was possible despite limitations? When had she convinced herself that her wheelchair defined what she could and couldn't experience? As the evening approached and they moved back inside, Arthur began preparing dinner with the same efficient routine he had maintained for 4 years. Mrs. Gwynn watched him work, noting the practiced way he multitasked, stirring pasta while helping Maureen with a homework question.
They worked together with surprising ease, Mrs. Gwen handling vegetables from her seated position while Arthur managed the stove. The girls set the table and chattered about their day, filling the kitchen with the comfortable chaos of family life. During dinner, something shifted. The conversation flowed naturally, with Mrs. Gwen sharing stories from her years at the library and the girls reciprocating with tales from school and their friends. Arthur found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since Margaret's death. "Miss Gwen, do you have anywhere you need to be tomorrow?" The question hung in the air, loaded with possibility and hope. Mrs. Gwen looked around the table at these 3 faces that had become so dear to her in less than 24 hours. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "I don't have anywhere I need to be." "Good," Laura said with satisfaction, "because we want to show you our favorite park, and Daddy promised we could go to the library this week, and we still need help with our science project." Arthur watched his daughters casually plan a future that included Mrs. Gwen, and something loosened in his chest. For 4 years, he had carried the weight of being everything to his children, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it alone anymore. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Arthur and Mrs. Gwen sat in the living room with cups of tea. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. "Thank you," Mrs. Gwen said suddenly. "For what?" "For saving my life last night, and I don't just mean from the rain." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Gwen, can I tell you something? I think maybe you saved us, too."
1 year passed like a beautiful dream that Mrs. Gwen kept expecting to end. But instead of fading, the bond between her and the Bruno family only grew stronger. She never returned to that bus stop. Instead, she found herself becoming an integral part of a household that had desperately needed her presence without even knowing it. The transformation was gradual but profound. Mrs. Gwen's days, which had once stretched endlessly with nothing but memories and regret, became filled with purpose and joy. She helped the girls with homework every afternoon, taught them to bake Harold's favorite cookies, and became their confidant for problems both big and small. For Arthur, having Mrs. Gwen there was a revelation he hadn't expected. The crushing weight of single parenthood began to lift as he discovered what it meant to truly share the responsibility of raising his daughters. "I've been thinking," Arthur said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the girls play in the yard. It was autumn again, and the leaves were beginning to turn the same colors they had been that first day. About what? Mrs. Gwen asked, though she sensed the seriousness in his tone. About making this official. I mean, legally. I'd like to adopt you as family. Mrs. Gwen's breath caught. Arthur, you don't... I want to, he said firmly. The girls need you. I need you. You're not a guest here anymore, Mrs. Gwen. You're family. You have been since that first breakfast. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks. I never imagined. At 71 years old, I never thought I'd have a family again. Age doesn't matter when it comes to love, Arthur said softly. Margaret always said that. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing each other, every day. The girls ran up to the porch, their faces flushed with excitement. What are you two talking about? Maureen demanded. We're talking about something very important. Arthur pulled both girls onto his lap. How would you feel if Mrs. Gwen became your official grandmother? The shriek of joy that erupted from both twins could probably be heard 3 houses away. Really? Laura gasped. She'd really be our grandma? If she wants to be, Arthur said, looking at Mrs. Gwen with questioning eyes. Mrs. Gwen reached out and took both girls' hands in her weathered ones. I would be honored to be your grandmother. I've wanted to be someone's grandmother my whole life. The legal proceedings were simple, but the emotional significance was immeasurable. On a sunny day in spring, Mrs. Gwen officially became Grandma Gwen to Maureen and Laura Bruno. Keep watching. You won't believe how this story continues to unfold. The best part is still coming.
Years flowed by in a rhythm of school events, family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments that built the foundation of genuine love. Mrs. Gwen taught the girls about resilience, about finding joy in small moments, and about the strength that comes from surviving life's cruelest disappointments. The girls taught her about hope, about laughter that comes from the belly, and about the possibility of new beginnings at any age. Arthur found his own healing in watching his makeshift family thrive. The crushing isolation of single parenthood became a shared journey of growth and discovery. Mrs. Gwen's wheelchair became as much a part of the family landscape as Arthur's work boots by the door or the girls' artwork covering the refrigerator. The house that had once echoed with the hollow sound of loss now rang with genuine happiness. When the twins turned 16, they threw Mrs. Gwen a surprise party for her 80th birthday. The living room was decorated with handmade banners, and they presented her with a photo album documenting their 7 years together as a family. I never imagined, Mrs. Gwen whispered, clutching the album against her chest, that my 80th year would be among the happiest of my life. You saved us, Grandma Gwen, Maureen said, using the name that had become as natural as breathing. You saved all of us. By the time the girls reached 17, they had grown into remarkable young women, compassionate, resilient, and wise beyond their years. They spoke about their mother with love rather than only sadness, and they couldn't imagine life without the grandmother who had chosen them as much as they had chosen her. The day came when both girls received acceptance letters to college, Maureen to study education, inspired by Mrs. Gwen's patient teaching, and Laura to pursue engineering, following in Arthur's footsteps. I can't believe my babies are leaving for college, Mrs. Gwen said, her voice thick with emotion. At 78, she was still vibrant, her eyes bright with the life that had returned to them 9 years ago. You'll always be our grandma, Maureen assured her, hugging the woman who had become the heart of their family. Distance won't change that. Arthur, now 43 with silver threading through his hair, watched his daughters comfort the woman who had saved them all. Mrs. Gwen, you know this will always be your home, right? Whether the girls are here or not. She nodded, tears flowing freely. You gave me a family when I thought I'd lost everything. You taught me that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. 9 years after that rain-soaked November night, Arthur and Mrs. Gwen sat together on the porch, as they had countless times before. The girls were away at their respective colleges, but they called every Sunday without fail, filling their grandmother in on every detail of their lives. Do you ever think about that night at the bus stop? Arthur asked quietly. Every day, Mrs. Gwen replied, her voice strong and peaceful. I was so ready to give up. I thought my story was over.
Maybe that's when your real story began, Arthur suggested. All of our real stories. Mrs. Gwen smiled, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. 9 years ago, I was convinced I had nothing left to offer the world. Now I know that sometimes our greatest purpose finds us when we least expect it. She reached over and took Arthur's hand the same way she had taken the girls' hands on that first morning when they had asked her to stay. "You know what I learned sitting in that wheelchair at that bus stop?" she said softly. "What's that?" "I learned that sometimes when we think we're at the end of our story, we're actually at the beginning of the most beautiful chapter we never saw coming." The autumn breeze stirred the leaves in the yard where 2 little girls had once played, where teenage girls had learned to drive, where a broken family had learned to heal. The house stood as a testament to the unexpected ways love can reshape our lives. In choosing to stop at that bus stop, Arthur had saved more than Mrs. Gwen's life. He had saved his own family from a loneliness they didn't even realize they were carrying. And in choosing to stay for breakfast that first morning, Mrs. Gwen discovered that sometimes the family we need finds us exactly when we need them most. The porch fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft creak of the rocking chairs and the rustle of leaves dancing in the evening wind. The house behind them glowed warmly, its walls filled with memories they had built together. Birthdays and graduations, bedtime stories and whispered prayers, laughter and tears. For Mrs. Gwen, it was no longer just Arthur's home. It was her home, a place where she was not a burden, but a blessing. Where her life, once deemed over, had blossomed into a second chance she never thought possible. And for Arthur and his daughters, she was no longer the lonely woman they had rescued on a rain-soaked night. She was family, the missing piece that had helped stitch their broken hearts back together.
As the stars shone brighter above them, Mrs. Gwen leaned back in her chair, peace etched into every line of her face. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the end. She was living fully in the middle of a story still being written. A story about love found in unlikely places. A story about second chances. A story about a single dad, his 2 daughters, and the grandmother they never knew they needed. Because sometimes the most beautiful families aren't the ones we're born into. They're the ones we choose. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you of the power we all have to change someone's life with a simple act of kindness, please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our Soul Lift Stories family. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that sometimes when we think we're at the end of our story, we're actually at the beginning of the most beautiful chapter we never saw coming.